In 1704, a Franco-Bavarian army's attempt to threaten Vienna and knock Austria out of the War of the Spanish Succession was blunted at the Battle of Blenheim by a Grand Alliance army led by John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, and Prince Eugene of Savoy. After the victory at Blenheim, momentum in the war had now gathered in the Allies' favour. Marlborough and Eugene would seize this opportunity to take the fight to the Bourbon, shifting the war effort back to the Low Countries and northern Italy. Desiring to regain the strategic initiative, King Louis XIV ordered his marshals to make preparations for a surprise grand offensive on all fronts, scheduled to begin in the spring campaigning season of 1706. To counter the northern threat, Marlborough took to the field in Flanders and engaged the French and Bavarian armies in a battle that would become his tactical masterpiece. Welcome to our third video on the seminal War of Spanish Succession, focusing on the lead-up to and climax of the decisive Battle of Ramillies. Our members and patrons are right now watching a 5-hour documentary on the War of the Spanish Succession. Join them via the links in the description or pinned comment, or by scanning the QR code to watch this and more than 300 other exclusive videos. After the Allies' crushing victory at the Battle of Blenheim in August 1704, the Bavarian Elector Maximilian II was forced to flee his country, which was quickly occupied by the Austrians. Despite the Allies' great victory, the Battle of Blenheim had done little to affect the strategic outcome of the overall war. Marlborough planned to follow up his success with a vigorous offensive into the Moselle River Valley the next year. Unfortunately, Marlborough was confronted with seemingly endless indecision, timidity, and an apparent lack of commitment by his Dutch allies. The Dutch States General, believing the Low Countries theatre should have the highest priority of the war effort, continually frustrated Marlborough's offensive plans along the Rhine and Moselle. Thus, the 1705 campaign devolved into a stalemate. Marshal Villeroi, commanding the French army of Flanders, remained just out of reach of Marlborough's army, thus preventing the Captain General from achieving a decisive victory. Unable to commit his allies or draw his enemies into a decisive battle, Marlborough's primary success in 1704 was diplomatic. That summer, he conducted a prolonged tour of all the Allied headquarters in every theatre of the war, managing through his charismatic personality to solidify the politically strained Grand Alliance. The one significant action of the 1705 campaign was the passing of the Lines of Brabant. The Lines of Brabant were a series of defensive earthworks, fortifications and obstacles, stretching for 96 kilometers from the sea at Antwerp to the Meuse River at Namur. To take these fortifications, Marlborough devised a cunning and deceptive plan. He kept this plan secret from his Dutch allies, save for the elderly Field Marshal Henry de Nassau, Lord of Overkirk, whom the Duke trusted greatly. Marlborough intentionally leaked information to Villeroi that he planned to launch a feint to the north and then attack the lines at their weakest point in the south. Following this, Overkirk would cross the Meuse on 4 bridges and then build 7 more pontoon bridges, as if preparing for a major army crossing. Upon receiving these false yet seemingly logical intelligence leaks, Villeroi took the bait and believed it was his opponent's true plan. Marlborough's actual attack plan was in fact quite different. While Villeroi led his army of Flanders south on July 17th, Overkirk quickly reversed his direction and double-quick marched north, taking up the rear of Marlborough's main army, which had moved out that night. On July 18th, 1705, English troops appeared opposite the Lines of Brabant at the town of Elixheim, considered one of the line's main strongpoints, and was thus lightly manned. In a quick assault lasting less than 2 hours, Marlborough's army succeeded in passing the Lines of Brabant. The Battle of Elixheim was a major victory and led to the capture of 3,000 prisoners, including the French general commanding in the sector. However, Marlborough was unable to exploit the victory to seize the nearby town of Louvain, as Overkirk's exhausted units were unable to conduct any further action after their long march at double-quick pace. Despite this, the Allied army was now in a favourable position to turn Villeroi flank and rear. And so, Marlborough deployed his army for battle on good defensive ground, just south of the village of Waterloo. Now realising the precarious situation the army was in, Villeroi opted to sacrifice Louvain to the Allies, and instead marched to defend Brussels, the political capital of the Spanish Netherlands. Marlborough saw an opportunity to secure victory in the theatre in one fell swoop by taking Brussels. Yet once again, his Dutch and German allies hesitated and used their veto power, forcing Marlborough to surrender the initiative and merely hold his newly gained ground for the rest of the year. The remainder of the 1705 campaign was wasted with idleness on both sides, so Marlborough's success at the Battle of Elixheim had merely set up the conditions for a greater victory the following year. In 1706, Marlborough suggested that a campaign be launched into northern Italy, where he would join forces with Prince Eugene and relieve the enemy's pressure on Turin, thus freeing the Duke of Savoy and his army. Once this had been achieved, the Allies, in conjunction with Rooke's fleet in the Mediterranean, would use their combined armies for a grand offensive against the French city of Toulon. Despite receiving support for this plan from Queen Anne, the other Allied leaders objected to Marlborough's strategy, and he was forced to resume his campaign in the Low Countries theatre. The 1706 campaign of the Low Countries theatre began with Marlborough's army advancing towards the fortress town of Namur in another attempt to lure the Bourbon armies into a pitched battle. On May 17th, the English and Dutch troops assembled at Tongres to await the arrival of the Hessian and Hanoverian contingents, with the Prussian contingent being withheld until certain political grievances were addressed. Marlborough decided to go on without them. As he commenced his movement towards Namur, the Captain General was pleasantly surprised to learn that Villeroi's army of Flanders was marching to intercept him, having already crossed the Deal River and moving towards the village of Tillemont. The Bourbons had changed their strategy. The Bourbons' change in strategy came straight from the top at Versailles. After learning that his treasury was 25 million francs in debt, King Louis began to consider initiating peace talks. The Bourbons' current passive defensive strategy was ineffective and financially unsustainable, and was giving the Allies the initiative in the war. In order to strengthen his hand at the peace table, Louis ordered Villeroi to go on the offensive, while Marshal Vendôme would simultaneously besiege Turin, thus tying down the Duke of Savoy's and Prince Eugene's armies in northern Italy. On May 20th, Marlborough learned that Villeroi had shifted his direction southwards and was moving towards the gap dividing the Moëgne River from the Petite Guette stream. Sending a dispatch to his Danish cavalry squadrons to make all haste towards his position, Marlborough began turning south. 2 days later, his army encamped near the village of Cossoirem, where the Danish horse contingent joined him after a forced march. Around 1 AM, Marlborough ordered his Quartermaster General, Earl William Cadogan, to conduct a reconnaissance of the high ground between the Moëgne and Petite Guette for a suitable campground, with the Duke's intention being to occupy the high ground plateau around the nearby village of Ramillies. 2 hours after Cadogan's departure, the main army followed. At 8 AM on Sunday, May 23, 1706, the morning mist lifted across the high plateau around Ramillies, revealing to General Cadogan the dispositions of the Bourbon army deploying in front of him. The Bourbons were advancing in 2 columns of infantry, with their artillery in the centre and their cavalry already having deployed forward and ready for action. At once, Cadogan sent an aide riding back to inform Marlborough. 2 hours later, the Duke came up, riding at the head of his army, arranged in 8 grand marching columns, which were struggling to catch up to him on dirt roads and cart paths turned to mud from recent rains. As Marlborough watched with an unimpeded view, the French army deployed into lines of battle. Villeroi and his ally, Elector Maximilian Emmanuel of Bavaria, arranged their 60,000 French, Bavarian and Spanish troops into a 6-kilometer wide front, which stretched in an arc shape from the villages of Francois and Taviers on its right, along the Moëgne River through Ramillies in its centre, and towards the villages of Offus and Autre-Église on their left. Running along the length of the French left flank was the Petite Guette, surrounded by swampy ground and steep, slippery banks. Villeroi was determined to avoid Tallard's mistakes at Blenheim, so he deployed his army's 70 foot battalions, 132 horse squadrons, and 70 guns, with Tallard's errors in mind. Francois was occupied with a token force of dismounted Spanish dragoons, and Taviers was guarded only by a single infantry brigade. In the plain between Ramillies and Taviers were placed 82 horse squadrons, intermixed with strong infantry support. Among these on the front line were the 13 squadrons of France's elite Royal Household Cavalry Regiment, the Maison du Roi. 20 battalions were placed in and around Ramillies, with the bulk of Villeroi infantry and the rest of his 50-horse squadrons positioned behind the Petit Guet from Ramillies past Offus to Autre-Église. While he would personally oversee the left flank from behind Offus, Villeroi entrusted his centre and right flank to the commands of Pierre de Montesquieu, Count d'Artagnan, and the Marquis Antoine de Descartes, respectively. At 11 am, Marlborough began deploying his army of 62,000 Dutch, Danish, German, English and Scottish troops into lines of battle opposite the Bourbon. 12 foot battalions of English and Scottish redcoats were positioned on his right flank, supported by 39 English horse squadrons led by Lord George Hamilton, Earl of Orkney. These troops were from the best regiments of the English army. In his centre, Marlborough placed 58 battalions under the command of John Campbell, Duke of Argyll. On his left was placed the bulk of his cavalry, 69 Dutch squadrons posted directly opposite Villeroi cavalry under the command of Field Marshal Overkirk. On the far left flank, opposite Franconet, he placed 4 Dutch and Danish battalions in a brigade commanded by Colonel Hans Felix Wertmüller. While Marlborough's infantry and cavalry contingents were roughly equal to Villeroi, comprised of 74 to 70 foot battalions and 123 to 132 horse squadrons, Marlborough enjoyed superiority in artillery, with 120 cannons compared to Villeroi 70 guns. Furthermore, 100 of these guns were heavy 24-pounder howitzers. These Marlborough positioned with great care. By 1 p.m, the Allied army was fully deployed for battle. Marlborough's plan was to attack the flanks of Villeroi army, thus forcing the French to shift the bulk of their forces away from the centre. This would enable Marlborough to concentrate his attack on the central plain between Ramillies and Taviers. The Duke opted to conduct a probing attack on Villeroi right, towards the villages of Franconet and Taviers, while also launching a feint against the French left around Offus and Autre-Église. Once Villeroi shifted troops away from his centre to deal with these attacks, Marlborough would exploit the Marshal's weakened central line and attack across the plain, punching through the right centre and rolling up their line from right to left. With his deployment complete, Marlborough gave the order to attack, beginning on the enemy's right at 1 p.m. Simultaneously, a massive artillery duel ensued, with the heavy cannonade thundering across the plateau. The Dutch siege guns would eventually give the Allies the advantage in the artillery exchange. On the French right flank, Wertmüller's brigade began its advance against Franconet, driving out the compound's contingent of dismounted Spanish dragoons and forcing them back towards the main French line in front of Taviers. Wertmüller's 4 battalions, supported by 2 light guns, continued pressing down the road, driving back the French, Spanish and Swiss mercenary troops from Taviers back onto a new defensive line west of the town, close to the confluence of the Meurnier and the Vesoul stream. Realizing the threat to their rear, French commanders on the ground acted quickly to secure their right flank and halt Wertmüller's advance. Guiscard sent forward 5 dragoon regiments from his rear line to quickly drive back the Allied thrust. However, as they neared the rain-swollen waters of the Vesoul stream, the dragoons encountered muddy ground and dismounted before pressing onward. While the French dragoons moved through the mud, Wertmüller's battalions fired heavy volleys into their disorganized lines. The Dutch and Danish musketry stalled the advance of the dragoons, inflicting heavy casualties. Guiscard fully appreciated the danger to his flank, and so he ordered 2 full infantry brigades to move to the dragoons' aid. Despite their numeric advantage, the Bourbon regiments were thrown against Wertmüller's brigade piecemeal, allowing Wertmüller the opportunity to push back their counterattacks one by one. 2 French battalions succeeded in reaching the Dutch and Danish right flank, and poured enfilading fire into their lines, but Colonel Wertmüller held his ground. The clumsy and uncoordinated Bourbon attacks were soon driven back one after another in their desperate attempt to dislodge Wertmüller's brigade, effectively wrecking Villeroi right flank. On the French left, Marlborough soon launched his next attack. At 2:30 p.m, Orkney advanced with his infantry towards the Petit Guet, angling towards Autre-Église and Offus. His redcoats struggled through the deep mire, all while being harassed by French pickets and bombarded by enemy artillery, suffering mounting losses in the process. The Petit Guet hampered the English attempts to close with the enemy, and dead and wounded redcoats began littering the hillsides and bloodying the stream. Despite these obstacles, Orkney's English and Scottish troops pressed onwards, with Orkney personally leading his soldiers in front and on foot. His right flank angled towards Outreéglise, while his left remained anchored on the Petite Guette. The German and Walloon infantry holding Outreéglise let loose devastating volleys on Orkney's regiments, yet the redcoats pressed forward despite the hail of musketry, threatening the Bourbon left. General Christian von Birkenfeld, sensing the danger to Villeroi's flank, ordered a spirited counterattack by the French Regiment de War. The elite French unit managed to tear into the Allied column and halted their advance. A bloody melee ensued around Outreéglise with clubs and bayonets, and the Regiment de War eventually managed to drive the redcoats back. Orkney ordered another attack on the town, and watched as his Englishmen and Scotsmen pushed forward past him. Soon, however, Marlborough gave the order for Orkney to disengage from Villeroi's left. Finding the order ridiculous, and believing the tactical situation in front of him was in their favour, Orkney pressed on with his assault, refusing Marlborough's orders. Frustrated by Orkney's refusal to disengage from Outreéglise, Marlborough dispatched Cadogan with direct orders from himself to withdraw. Finally, after a heated argument, Orkney relented. Unbeknownst to Orkney, while his gallant redcoats were pressuring Villeroi's left flank, Marlborough began putting his main attack plan in motion to smash the right centre of Villeroi's line. As Villeroi began sending battalions and squadrons to his left flank, Marlborough concentrated the bulk of his cavalry facing the weakened French centre and right. After setting his trap, Marlborough finally made the decision to unleash his heavy cavalry against the weakened French right flank, which Wertmüller's brigade had pushed back. Field Marshal Overkirk would command the attack. Marlborough dispatched an additional 21 squadrons of horse and dragoons under General Matthias Hooft to support Overkirk's impending assault. The lead columns of Overkirk's cavalry began their advance slowly, saving their energy for the grand charge. They passed south of Ramillies and then caught sight of the enemy horsemen. Guiscard ordered the elite Maison de War cavalry regiment forward to break up the momentum of Overkirk's attack. The French came forward at full gallop, and so the Allied cavalry closed ranks to form a solid wall of horses and steel. At the last possible moment, both sides went into full gallop and smashed into each other in a thunderous crash of cavalry. In a maelstrom of falling horses, swinging sabres, and stricken horsemen, one of the largest cavalry battles of the 18th century unfolded on the plains in front of Ramillies. The French finally gained the upper hand and pushed into the rear ranks of the Allied horse squadrons. Combat shifted eastward as Overkirk's troopers gave ground and fled to the south of Ramillies under pressure from the elite French cavalry. The French squadrons, exuberant at their success, pressed the advantage. Soon, however, they faced stiffer resistance as Allied officers rallied their horsemen for countercharges. The fighting soon degenerated into a bloody brawl as both sides funneled more and more horsemen into the action. After giving orders for more squadrons to be brought forward, Marlborough personally galloped into the melee to bring order to his men and raise morale. In the confusion of the fighting, the Duke became separated from his escort and was thrown to the ground by his horse. Seeing that their Captain General was about to be captured or even killed, General Robert Murray and his Swiss mercenary troopers rushed forward to rescue him. The horsemen reached Marlborough just in time to drive off a French attack on his position. To the north of the cavalry battle, Marlborough issued orders that would deliver the fatal blow to the Bourbon army on the field. In front of Ramillies, a strong contingent of Allied infantry arranged themselves into a three-line deep formation for a massed assault on the Bourbon centre. Moving forward, they were subjected to a heavy cannonade, but the Allied infantry pushed ahead into the town itself, where they were met with stiff resistance from troops entrenched around buildings, yards, and fence rails. Dutch reserve brigades were brought forward to support the attack, while the Duke of Argyll led his Scots brigade from the front into Ramillies. The Bourbon defenders around the town rapidly grew demoralised as their lines were overlapped by the sheer number of Allied infantry regiments. The Bavarians on the Bourbon right flank in Ramillies gave way after coming under a vigorous charge by the Dutch guards. Fighting continued to rage around the town centre and the churchyard, where the Scots became engaged in a bloody melee with a battalion of Irish troops in French service. Little quarter was given on either side as casualties mounted. Back on the left flank, the cavalry action was now going against the French. 4,000 Danish horsemen rode forward to support Overkirk's embattled Dutch squadrons. As the Danish horse regiments plunged into the melee, their numbers tipped the scales in Overkirk's favour, turning the tide of the battle. Finally overwhelmed, the exhausted French troopers began falling back in disorder. Guiscard finally ordered his squadrons to begin a full retreat. The Bourbon cavalry attempted to reform in the rear of Villeroi's line, but Overkirk gave chase before stopping to regroup his own exhausted horsemen. With the Bourbon centre in great danger of collapsing, General d'Artagnan positioned 5-foot battalions facing south to guard against the victorious Allied cavalry in a desperate attempt to buy time for the army's retreat. In Ramillies, the Franco-Bavarian troops began falling back in disorder, and before long, the town fell into Allied hands. Marlborough continued pouring regiments into the centre to exploit his breakthrough. Realising his position was now untenable, Villeroi ordered a retreat and redeployment around the village of Offy. He hoped his position would buy time to disengage and withdraw towards Louvain. Troops trapped in Ramillies, cut off by the Allies, were ordered to abandon their baggage and try to escape by any means. But Marlborough gave his enemy little respite. After Overkirk's squadrons were reinforced and regrouped, Marlborough set nearly 18,000 horsemen loose in a broad sweep across the French rear. In the face of such an impressive and overwhelming charge, Bourbon resistance effectively crumbled before the Allies. Overkirk's horsemen began wreaking havoc among stragglers and the Bourbon baggage train, disrupting enemy units. Witnessing these successes, Lord Orkney, on the right flank, pressed towards Autre-Église once again. On the far right, Lord John Hay's Scottish and Irish cavalry regiments launched a grand charge on the French Maison du Roi as these troops were gathering their baggage, catching them by surprise. Hay's horse squadrons tore through 2 battalions of the regiment before the French guards were able to reform their lines and drive off the cavalry assault with several concentrated volleys. Villeroi was stunned by the reversal of fortunes on the battlefield and now ordered a general retreat. The Bourbons attempted to extract themselves from the battlefield as best they could to regroup at Toulemont, and the French marshal narrowly succeeded at withdrawing his army from complete destruction at the hands of Marlborough's victorious forces. By 6:30 p.m, Marlborough was master of the battlefield. The Battle of Ramillies was a decisive Allied victory, and nearly succeeded in completely destroying Villeroi's army of Flanders. The Bourbons had lost between 13,000 to 15,000 men, while Marlborough had suffered around 3,000 to 4,000 total casualties. The battle would prove disastrous for King Louis's war effort. In the wake of his total victory, Marlborough continued to press his offensive against Villeroi's shattered army, pushing it all the way to the frontiers of France. 2 days after the battle began, Louvain fell to the Allies, with Brussels falling on May 27th, and Antwerp being captured on June 5th. By the end of the 1706 campaigning season in Flanders, the French were driven almost entirely out of the Spanish Netherlands. More good news soon arrived for the Allies, when Prince Eugene of Savoy's imperialist army in northern Italy relieved the siege of Turin on September 7, 1706. In a broad arc all across Europe, the Bourbon armies were now in full retreat in the wake of the Grand Alliance's successes. The campaigns of 1706 had been a great victory for the Grand Alliance, and at their current rate of success, total Allied victory in the War of the Spanish Succession was all but certain. This series will soon continue. To ensure you don't miss it, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.